neighbors. And so it cannot qualify to be a humanitarian action. But then there's the word human, which maybe most of these words have been emanating from. And of course, when we say who is a human, we refer to a man. But in the sense that we are going to be using it here in this series, it may describe who is, it may describe a man who is good to his fellow beings. And that's why you will hear someone saying, so and so is very human. Does it mean that so and so ceases to be man or woman? No, that does not mean that. But it means that that person has been very good to his fellow beings. Then the word humanity. From the dictionary, humanity is defined as a sentiment of active goodwill towards mankind. And that is just it. Yeah. When we say someone has, humanity, we are referring to a sentiment of active goodwill towards other mankind. But then the buzzword in this series is humanitarian, just as it has been in other series. And what does humanitarian mean? Humanitarian, if you look at the history of humanitarian, it comes from the word humanitas. Humanitas is a Latin word which means the universal value of human dignity and kindness or even benevolence. But essentially, what does humanitarian mean when we refer to it in this case? It is a very broad term, as you have already heard from the past series. It actually refers to actions. When you say so, humanitarian is a humanitarian action. Humanitarian can also refer to people, but again, it refers to organizations that are committed to the relief of human suffering and the protection of human dignity. And this happens mainly in times of crisis, natural crisis, or armed conflict. But in the legal sense, or rather in the professional sense, it is a duty, It's a duty to use our resources and skills in order to protect life. And not just protect life, but to also alleviate suffering. Okay? So then humanitarianism is a doctrine of humanitarian. Yeah, sounds like a tongue twister. I know that you have interacted with the word philanthropy. Philanthropy is, you once heard someone saying, when you feel sufficiently philanthropic, is just an act of giving, okay? And it doesn't even, it's an act of giving, but it has no relation with humanitarianism. And so pity, in this case, is one of the driving forces of charity. Because when you pity someone, it is a spontaneous feeling of compassion. And then sometimes it is also the forerunner of charity. When you feel pity, then you think that I feel pity, then I can be sufficiently philanthropic, or I can give charity. So for us to be able to understand today's topic, we need to go back to history. And when we go back to history, we are not going into the depth of this history, but what we are going to do is that we are going to lay the foundation. And so humanitarianism is not something that is just in this we see it in the modern way. It is something that began in the ancient civilization. You will realize that the religions and our culture, the traditions, they emphasized compassion and protection. So these were the early codes that limited violence and protected, people from adverse effects of wars and such. So very fast forward into the Middle Ages, we still see that these codes of are being embedded in culture and also religion. But the most important and the foundation of the most humanitarianism is actually in the 19th century. And why do we say so? Humanitarianism has not or is not only limited to those countries or to those places where armed conflict has taken place. It's actually a global movement. And this global movement has been in response to the horrors of warfare, where there was the absence of protection. But the key turning point was the Battle of Solferino, which was witnessed by Henry Donner. Henry Donner was, for those of you who have read history, he was a Swiss businessman who was visiting, I think, Napoleon III or something like that. And he witnessed the immense suffering of the wounded soldiers who had been abandoned on the battlefield. And by the way, he was the first person to win the first Nobel Prize in 1901. If you read the history of the Nobel Peace Prize, he was actually the first person. So after he had witnessed the war, he documented it in a book, which he called A Memory of Solferino, in which he advocated that there is a need, for the formation of an organization that would provide relief for the wounded without necessarily discriminating them or necessarily, doing it discriminately. So in 1863, if I'm not very wrong, there was a member of 5 persons committee that sought to put in place a plan. And so what did they do? They wanted to form a relief agency. Yeah. And they also wanted the government to recognize that relief agency, which was formed on the basis of being neutral. Okay. And so he formed the International Committee. He's the founder of the International Committee of the Red Cross, together with the 4 other people. But again, you see now when they formed this organization, there was no basis for which it had been formed, because it could just be looked at as any other, formation. So a year later, in the Swiss government organized a diplomatic conference, and and that is now what formed the first Geneva Convention of 1864. And of course, that was the basis on which the International Committee of Red Cross was adopted. Essentially, many people have always wondered, where did the international humanitarian law begin? That was indeed the basis on which the rules of international law rests on. Okay? So then thereafter, we have had so many, the Hague Convention, and then after the post-World War, we had the United Nations, which was established in 1945. And then, of course, around the same time, now that is when the 4 Geneva Conventions were adopted. As I have already mentioned, this indeed established the international humanitarian law as a global legal framework, and it focused on civilians, on wounded and the sick, and the humanitarian relief. So let's go to fast forward. Okay. Fast forward, we see in the 1990s, we have seen the humanitarian era. It has undergone so many reforms until in the late 2005 to present, we have the cluster system that has been introduced. And this has actually strengthened the coordination mechanism, the humanitarian law adapted to modern conflict and disasters. So, our reflection. Does really humanitarian law exist? Yeah. And this is not something that I'm asking for an answer out right now, but it's something that I want us to go through this series. We reflect on it and we ask ourselves, from the history of the humanitarianism, does it truly exist beyond political and donor interests? Okay? Because humanitarian is meant to be about helping people in need. Okay? But more often than not, you will find that it depends on donors and governments for funding. So these donors can decide where and how this aid is being given based on their own political and economic interests. So the question that we keep on asking ourselves, does true humanitarianism really exist? And if it does it really exist, to save life? Or it lives in the hands of the ordinary people. It lives saving life in the hands of the ordinary people, such as the doctors, volunteers, teachers, and even community workers. But at the end of the day, you will realize that actually the true heroes of humanitarianism are those that show compassion. Okay, even when no one is actually watching. Sometimes we do this, we carry out humanitarian interventions because we want the camera to watch. So we look at the next one. So in order for us now to structure humanitarian interventions, there was need for the principles. And what are these principles? Are you able to see my slides?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So, in order for us to structure and to ensure that humanitarianism gets to the people that actually requires it, then there was need for the humanitarian principles. And so, who had to advocate for this? The people that had to advocate for this, or rather the agency that had uh, to advocate for this, was the International Committee of the Red Cross. Remember, it has been formed already. We already have the conventions. They have already been put in place. But still, there was need for someone to advocate for these principles on which the humanitarian interventions would base their actions on. And so we ask ourselves, what are the principles? Indeed, the principles are just a set of guidelines that govern the way the humanitarian interventions and response can be carried out. And these principles are central to establishing, number one, and maintain, of course, number two, and also coordinate access to affected persons. They're just the laws, they're just the guidelines, they're just the norms, they're just the rules. Okay? And so the bedrock of the modern humanitarian action, which is ICRC, advocated for the formation of these principles. And what are these principles? Many a times people have wondered whether we only have the four principles, that's humanity, neutrality, impartiality, or independence, or we have seven. Okay? So we actually have the core humanitarian principles, which are four. And these four humanitarian principles are embedded in the Geneva protocols, in the protocols. So the other three are actually specific to International Red Cross and Red Crescent movements. So they guide the Red Crescent, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement, as much as they are also the principles, but they are not the core principles, as recognized by the UN bodies, such as the Office for the Coordination of Human Affairs, which we will be referring to as we go on as OCHA, and the Office of the UN High Commission for the Refugees. Of course, even the African Union recognizes the four. The European Union also recognizes the four. And even in the academic literature, we recognize the four. But organizations add on to these four main principles, or rather cardinal principles, so that they are able to coordinate their work. Okay. So interestingly to note is that although the 1994 Code of Conduct for the International Red Cross and non-governmental organization in disaster relief, which we commonly refer to as the Code of Conduct, it includes the principle of humanity, but it also includes other 6 additional principles. But what they do is that the core principles are usually mentioned first. Okay? And these 4 cardinal principles were not principles that were formed at a go. We will come to note that. But prior to 2003, before the UN system used just the 3. In fact, if you recall, sorry for saying you recall, because I thought I was talking to my colleagues. But if we recall the 1990 General Assembly, it only referred to 3: the principle of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. And they actually said must be given utmost consideration by all those involved in providing humanitarian assistance. While the 3 principles are expressly mentioned, you realize that independence is not mentioned. And why is that so? It is not that the General Assembly deemed independence as something that was as something that was unimportant at that time. Rather, independence at that time did not play any role in the international organization. Why? Because it was understood that at the time to mean that every state was actually autonomous. And so there was no need. So the 4th principle of independence was a result of co-opting humanitarian assistance in a very highly politicized context that addressed challenges that faced in preserving independence, especially for the local partners. And this was a result of targeting beneficiaries and the delivery of need services in affected areas where it was almost impossible to do that. So they had to, bring in the independence principle so that, even those people who were able to deliver the humanitarian actions and interventions could do so, because it was not possible at that point when now there was this competition in terms of who, superpowers and such kind of things. Okay. So let's analyze the humanitarian principles one by one. Just as we had already talked about, humanity. We had already defined it as a sentiment of goodwill towards mankind. It also means treatment in all circumstances in order to save lives. Of course, I had already mentioned that, and alleviate suffering, while also ensuring respect for the individuals. Humanity is the first fundamental principle of humanitarian response. It also means that all mankind shall be treated humanely, okay? And equally in all circumstances, just by ensuring that lives are saved, suffering is alleviated, but we also make sure that we respect the individuals. And this principle indeed affirms that all people share the same human dignity, and it doesn't discriminate against race, religion, politics, or even geographical areas. And therefore, it demands that in order to relieve these people from suffering and uphold dignity, whenever and wherever it is threatened, there must be humanity in those people that are taking part in the humanitarian interventions. But it doesn't come easy. It doesn't, it comes at a price, because there are also challenges that come with the application of this principle. And these challenges include limited resources. And when we say limited resources, what do we exactly mean? We mean that when a crisis has arisen, there are so many issues that need to be attended to. Uh, then there is now the need for the resources, which include food, uh, human resource, like for example, medical officers, nurses, and even money. Then there's the issue of now how do we prioritize this, you know? And so you find that because of the limited resources, the humanitarian actors have now to prioritize what needs to be done first and what needs not to be done. And so you see, it is a challenge to humanity. As much as one would want to do everything, or rather to assist those people that are affected, but they are limited by the resources. Then the other challenge is the media sensitized aid. And sometimes we say the media is the lethal pen when it comes to sensitization. And when it comes to sensitization, they can either break or make. And why do I say so? Because when a crisis is not captured well by the media, it is not possible for the affected people to get the much needed help. And when sometimes the media has captured it wrongly, then there's also a waste of resources, because people will arrive on the scene and yet they find that it is not even something that they needed to be on the ground. But humanity is also challenged by political barriers. And why do we say it is challenged by political barriers? Interestingly, there are times when some governments actually block access to certain population, even when they are in the most need, because maybe they are not, um, they are not what? It is not a regime that they are supporting, and sometimes it is just a matter of, bad governance. Okay, and so we find that even these principles, in applying the principle, they also face challenges. And these challenges sometimes cut across all the principles. Like, for example, we have seen the political pressure here, the political barriers there. But when it comes to neutrality, what exactly do we mean? We mean that when you are taking part in humanitarian intervention, you need not to take sides, whether in the conflict, whether directly or by allying yourself with one or another party of the conflict. Okay? So, in order to be neutral, one has to be above board, you know. And I said that these are the rules, these are these are the norms, these are the guidelines. So, if you're taking part in the humanitarian intervention, then, for you to qualify as one person who is actually a humanitarian actor, then you need not to take sides. And why do you not need to take sides? Because it will protect it when you're neutral. Actually, the humanitarian workers are protected by reducing the risk of being targeted. You can imagine if you went to um, say, a conflict area, and there you are, you're taking sides, you're likely to be stoned, you're likely to be killed. Okay? So it also helps to ensure that there's continued access to the population that is in need. Yeah? Regardless of which side of the divide they belong. But remember, as a humanitarian actor, you always need to preserve the credibility and legitimacy of that humanitarian action that you're working for, therefore making it more likely that all the parties that are actually in this conflict accept your presence and, of course, your assistance. Now, the challenges, as I have already said, they seem to be cutting across. This principle remains deeply contested. For those of you who have interacted, especially with the humanitarian actors, this is like I have interacted with people from Kenya Red Cross. Normally, when you ask them, what about being neutral? They will tell you being neutral is debatable. And why do they say that it is debatable? Because sometimes they are struggling. You know, they are in the middle of an injustice or justice. Sometimes they're in the middle of a dictator and democracy, or racism and anti-racism. And so, you see, we are all human beings. And let's say, for example, you've gone to an African country, you are a humanitarian um, actor, and you have gone into an African country, and then you find that there is open racism. Yeah, you will definitely take side with your, your people, of course. And so it is something that remains deeply contested because sometimes you are faced with a situation where you don't know what to do. But it has been called out so many times in many different circumstances. And so humanitarian actors are actually expected to live either by their oath or to be guided by this principle. But then there are also political pressures because donors, governments, say international bodies, they want to align, the whatever they are helping you with their policy. And so it makes it very difficult to stay neutral. Okay. And this is many a times I say it is indirectly compromising, neutrality. Because if you're giving me help, if you're giving me a donation, but then I have to align with your foreign policy, then where is my neutrality? Am I really being neutral? Okay. And at the same time, they're giving you the donation, but they also want to control access, you know they also want you to go to some control access, control the access of that donation. But remember also, you're going to a controlled access place. And so it often depends on negotiating with, maybe, say, the people who are on the ground, maybe the askaris and such kind of people. And then sometimes we are in here, someone will actually ask you, no, before you get access to this, I am going to demand for something. But because you want to get to that place, you see, you're also compromising your neutrality. And so it's something that is debatable. It's something that, you know, it has gotten to a point where those people who are actually working in this humanitarian space are questioning the issue of neutrality. And you see, now we are also using aid as a weapon, you know. I am going to give it to you, but you have to do this for me, you know. So it is being weaponized, right? Again, you find that there's some very difficult perceptions. Communities or armed groups still view themselves as aligned with a particular side because we are having wazungus on site, and you're looking at them and you're wondering, okay, whom do they want to support in this? And so you see, it is a bit difficult to even diffuse that perception. So more often than not, the media, the political actors, or maybe even the local, may label the humanitarian organization as biased. And that is purely perception. Okay? Asymmetric conflicts. In conflicts where one side is more powerful or internationally recognized. For example, you remember the Israel-Iran strikes, which actually created humanitarian fears. So neutrality as it is right now in the legal space and even with the legal actors, it is something that is being debated and it's actually being questioned whether should remain as a principle or we should put some sanctions on it. And that is a discussion that is still going on in the legal space. So now let's look at impartiality. What is impartiality? Impartiality is indeed the third of the four core humanitarian principles, as we have already looked at humanity and neutrality. But it means that aid, yeah, must be given based on the need, without discrimination, based on race, nationality, ethnicity, and all those. Yeah. This principle is actually enshrined in the international humanitarian law, just like the others, and it plays a very crucial role in ensuring that humanitarian action is actually effective and can be trusted. Yeah, because you cannot go to a place where there is no need and then you start saying, I want to bring the humanitarian intervention. But still, even if there is need, there's also challenges. And these challenges, as I've said, they cut across. We have already talked about political interference. We have talked about media pressure. But what about security constraints? Security constraints is a challenge in this way. There is inaccessibility of certain areas due to violence, uh, and so you are not able to deliver the aid to those that are in need. Yeah, because we fear, because we can't get there, because it is not possible. And so upholding this and with the challenges that it comes with is, to me, I have always seen it as a daily practice. You know, it's a daily practice that demands that one has to be courageous and one has to be consistent and of course clear on what the need is. So upholding it means making very tough decisions, especially when now you are faced with security constraints or there's resisting pressure and there's also continuous assessing needs in an unbiased way. Are we together? I hope so. So
Yes,
let's go on.
we are together. You can proceed.
Okay. Let's go on now to independence. Okay. So what does independence do or what does it mean? Independence ensures that humanitarian action or humanitarian organization remain autonomous in their decision making and, of course, actions. And they are free from influence by the governments, the donors, of course, the military forces, or other political and economic actors. And so it means that humanitarian action must be guided solely by the needs of the affected population and not by the strategic or political interests of any party. But there are aspects of independence. What are these aspects? The aspect of independence ensures that there is freedom from political influence, okay, such that humanitarian actors should not be used as tools of foreign policy. But how possible is that? You know, the way I'm asking these questions is that I am trying to make sure that you have a critical approach towards applying these principles. You have a critical way of looking at each of these principles. And so, another aspect of independence is most humanitarian organizations rely majorly on government or, say, institutional funding. And so they must ensure that funding does not come with political strings attached to it. And I think in the discussion of these principles, there's one thing that is common to each: political, political, and political influence. Okay? So humanitarian actors are actually supposed to live overboard, above the political influence, the political pressures, and ensure that they have their operations are autonomous. Just like the way we have talked about other principles, it matters that the humanitarian organization remain independent. This is because when they are not independent, they compromise their credibility and, of course, the trust that comes with it. For example, we can look at the center. How can it remain credible and how can it be trusted? If at all, they will come on the ground where they are needed to give their humanitarian intervention, yet they are affiliated to the government. It makes it hard for it to be done what? To be trusted. And then it also is a, a thing that enables them to have access to everybody in need. If you're independent, then you can pass. If you're not independent, then we can compromise you. And when we compromise you, your independence is also done what? Compromised. Just like any other, just like the three principles, it's also prone to challenges. And these challenges include government regulations. It includes public perception, which we have already talked about. How is it perceived and semblance of alignment with the political agenda? Yes, then you're not independent. Any semblance of say, living by the government regulations, then of course you are not independent. Then there's also that restriction uh, upon funding. Someone is giving you the funds to go and carry out a humanitarian intervention, but you're being restricted on what to do and what not to do. They are restricting you, they are giving you priorities, and sometimes these priorities, and I say it again, are politically motivated. In the many humanitarian interventions that I have participated in, most of the times when you see there are priorities shifting from one end to another, then you know that there is some politically motivated priorities. Okay? So, again, the integration with military operation, that goes without saying. So, these are the core principles of humanitarian actions. And they are core because they're universally endorsed. They are endorsed by the UN. They are also endorsed by ICRC, the International Committee of Red Cross, and the Red Cross movement. They are endorsed by the NGO. They are endorsed by the international law. And one of the things that makes them actually core, they are not negotiable. They are not negotiable, they are the foundations for all humanitarian actions. Okay? However, beyond the core, we have others. And this is specific. I am going to take an example of the International Red Cross because they are specific to the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement. And this include voluntary service, Humanitarian work is not driven by desire for profit, but it is driven by commitment to serve. I think we have, or some of us work with the Red Cross. Those people are committed to serve. They will go to any length in order to serve with humanity. You know, they have the other principle that guides their service, which is unity. In each country, there's only one Red Cross. In Kenya, we have one Red Cross that is open to all. It carries out all the humanitarian work nationwide. It doesn't discriminate. It will arrive when it is expected and when it is needed. Um, the other principle that is specific to International Red Cross and Red Crescent is the universality. The universality means that this movement is worldwide, with all societies having equal status, rights, and the duty to help one another. And that is the reason why you will see that when Red Cross comes around, they have the duty. They will do everything to ensure that everyone that is affected has been helped. And that is now they live by their principle of universality. Okay. So other organizations also have other applicable humanitarian principles such as accountability, participation and empowerment, do no harm, respect for local culture and capacity. I like the respect for local culture and capacity because there's that assistance that is built on the existing community, which was actually the bedrock of Henry Donner. Because you remember when we talked about the history of humanitarian actions, Henry Donner actually, when he found that there was soldiers who were suffering without help, he actually used the community to assist them. So as we look at the principles of the humanitarian principles, let's remember that we have four, which are non-negotiable, but we have others that are specific to organizations. And I like referring to International Red Cross and Red Crescent because they are the bedrock of these humanitarian principles. Okay, so we look at the convergence. When these principles converge, when they come together, what do we get? More often than not, you will find them pulling each other in the different direction. There's competition amongst them, there's humanity here, there's impartiality there, there's independence, there's neutrality, and sometimes there's a conflict amongst these principles. But why? Because they are speaking out against atrocities, but they are also risking appearing partial, like, for example, humanity and neutrality. And then when you look at independence and impartiality, taking government funding can threaten independence, but without funds, of course, there's the impartial aid delivery that may be impossible. So humanitarian actors must constantly try to balance them depending on the context. For those of you who have worked with Medicines Sans Frontiers, this is an organization that has often struggled with neutrality because when it publicly denounces atrocities, but sometimes again loses access as a result of that. So you see, there's that competition, there's that pulling in the different directions. But the convergency of this ensures that there's trust, there's access, there's safety, and there's integrity. Okay, so without one, the others become fragile. Okay, so in short, what we are saying is that the convergence of the four principles actually creates a coherent humanitarian identity. At this point, I want us to reflect on something. Yeah? And we are reflecting on, are these humanitarian principles a facade? When indeed most humanitarian operation depend on donor funding or individual government consent. Do I need an answer now? No, we will get there. So we now move to our next section, which is international humanitarian law. This part of our discussion today is majorly going to be basic. Basic meaning that we are not going to delve into the real international law as it is or as we understand it as lawyers, but we are going to deal with it basically and understand the basics of what can help us, where, and how. So, what is international law? International law is that part of the law, is that part of the international law that sets out rules to limit the effects of armed conflict. Where do we find it? It is domiciled in treaties and conventions, unlike our national laws. When you ask me where do we find our national laws, of course you'll tell me the Constitution, the Act of Parliament, and such. But these ones are domiciled in treaties. While these laws cover almost all areas of life in our society, and I mean the Kenya Constitution, the Acts of Law, the Constitution, our customary law, the international humanitarian law, which we also refer to as the law of war or the law of the armed conflict, specifically protects persons who are not or are no longer participating in war or hostilities, or rather, it also restricts the means and the methods of warfare. The origin, we have already talked about it, the Battle of Solferino, which happened in 1859, and the first Geneva Convention was passed in 1869. And then the rest of the Geneva Conventions came in 1949. How is it applicable? It is only applicable in situations of armed conflict and never in times of peace. You can never invoke international humanitarian law when there's peace. It can only be invoked in terms of armed conflict. It starts with the outbreak of hostilities and it remains in place until peace is restored. And it only applies to the territories that are affected by conflict. It does not apply in internal disturbances. We are having disturbances in Turkana, in Somali, or wherever. No, it doesn't apply. Riots, it doesn't apply. Isolated acts of violence that don't reach the threshold of armed conflict, it doesn't apply. So, applicability. Applicability, as I've already said, it only applies during armed conflict from outbreak of hostility until peace is restored. What is the area of coverage? The area of coverage is that it only covers international armed conflict. What do we mean by that? It is conflict between two or more states. What is the legal basis? The legal basis of international armed conflict is the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols. And then it also applies non-international armed conflicts, like, for example, conflict within a state between government forces and non-government forces. The common Article 3 applies in this case. Okay? But the coverage, it covers, as you can see from this table, the international humanitarian law covers people. And when we say people, who are these people? The first people that this humanitarian international humanitarian law seeks to protect are the civilians. And these civilians must never be attacked or targeted, loss of protection only when they take direct part in hostilities. And the legal basis of this, all of this, is the Geneva Conventions. And by the way, the Kenyan Constitution has accepted that all the treaties that Kenya is a signatory to forms part of our laws. And so when we say Geneva Conventions, Article this and that, as long as our country has assented or is a signatory to that treaty, we are bound by that convention. And so Kenya is bound. So another category of people who this IHL covers are the wounded and the sick and the shipwrecked. And this must be collected and cared for without discrimination. And when we talk about caring for, medical-wise, food-wise, dignity, protection, all those kind of things. And then also prisoners of war. They must also be captured and must be treated humanely and protected. No doubt about it, we must apply the principles of humanitarian, the humanitarian. We must treat them equally. We must treat them when they need. We must give them food. Medical and religious personnel, these are people who must be respected and allowed to carry out their duties, protected by emblems like the Red Cross. And that is why when you see when a conflict or a disaster has happened, by the way, this also touches on natural disasters. A conflict has happened and Red Cross arrives on the scene. I think most of you who have participated in these interventions or have been humanitarian actors have seen that when you arrive on the scene, as long as you have the Red Cross emblem, you are allowed. Yeah, you are allowed, and you can never be attacked. You are respected as long as you have that jacket with the red emblem. You are allowed to carry out your work. You are respected. In fact, the police and even, let's say, the terrorists will respect you. It just goes without saying. Then we also have the medical staff, which we have already talked about, and then, of course, the humanitarian workers. These humanitarian workers must also be protected and allowed to assist civilians impartially. And these humanitarian workers include nurses, include religious persons, include food, people who are distributing the food and food aid and all that. Then the humanitarian law also covers the means and methods of warfare. And the means of and methods of warfare, first of all, let's look at what means of warfare refer to. It refers to the weapons, yeah, the equipment, and maybe the technology that is being used in conflict. And why do I say technology? Because right now we have technology. It is not like the ancient times of 1945, maybe, when they didn't use technology, in the warfare and such. And so IHL limits both the weapons that are being used and the tactics that are actually employed in the war. So what are these prohibited and restricted weapons? Some of them are actually chemical weapons, which can cause severe or indiscriminate suffering. And the 1925 Geneva Protocol and the 1993 Chemical and Weapon Convention, if I'm not very wrong, is the legal instrument that ensures that chemical weapons are not used. Okay. Then there's also the biological weapons, where we spread uncontrolled diseases. Okay. Then there's the anti-personal landmines and personnel landmines, which continue. I think some of you have seen. We have anti-personnel landmines that explode or something like that have been exploding. They were left behind by the military and such. So this is also what is prohibited in use. So that these weapons that cause unnecessary or indiscriminate effects are actually banned by the international humanitarian law. Yeah, so expanding or exploding bullets, we have already talked about that. And all this, the legal basis is actually the additional protocol one that was passed in 1977. By the way, it's a very wide document, but under Article 35, it states, let me quote it. It states it is prohibited, just a minute, it is prohibited to employ weapons, projectiles, and materials and methods of warfare of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. Okay? So, what are the methods that are prohibited? The methods that are prohibited include terrorizing civilians. Why are you in the war and at the same time you are terrorizing civilians who are not actually participating in this war? It is prohibited. Starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, that they are not going to be given food, it is also prohibited. Using human as shields, it is also prohibited. So, and the rules on target is that the attacks should only be directed to military objectives. And most importantly, the distinction principle, which states that there must be a separation of civilians from combatants in targeting, in the targets. Okay? The accountability part, rules are only meaningful, as you all know, if there are consequences for breaking them. And I always tell my students is that the rules will be meaningless if there are no sanctions. And so there must be accountability for us to be able to get or rather to feel the importance of IHL. There must be sanctions. And those sanctions have ensured that there's accountability, from the states or from the people that are involved in the humanitarian interventions. So the legal basis of this still, it is the Geneva Conventions, the Roman Statutes, of the International Criminal Law, or Criminal Court, sorry. Yeah. And so the states have taken responsibility in order to ensure that there's respect for IHL. Just as I had said earlier, you will realize that our constitution, and I want to read for you verbatim, our constitution recognizes international law. And how does it recognize international law? Under Article 2 of our Constitution, Article 2(6), it says any treaty or convention ratified by Kenya shall form part of the law of Kenya under this Constitution. And so they have taken responsibility, okay? They have also taken responsibility to respect the treaty or the convention as ratified, and so they have a responsibility to ensure that our military is trained and is compliant with the international humanitarian law. Okay? So, the objects and property that need to be protected here is, of course, the civilian objects. Hospitals and schools should never be attacked. Our cultural heritage should never be touched. Our environment should be left free of any remnants of the war. Just like I was talking about, the the bombs that have been left behind. You know, there's a way that they are supposed to be disposed, and that is in line with the international humanitarian law. Okay, the environment must be left as it was, and it should never be interfered with, and so is the infrastructure. Okay, so what are the principles that govern all this? I had already talked about distinction. There's also the principle of proportionality. There is also the principle of necessity. We can only use, any force required to achieve legitimate military objective. And in terms of proportionality, the civilian harm, it's also called the harm principle, the civilian harm must never outweigh the expected military advantage. And also the issue of humanity, we have to always avoid unnecessary suffering and make sure that anyone who is either affected or participating in this is protected, their dignity is protected. So let's conclude on this and say that indeed international law exists not on paper, but it exists to stop wars and to make them more humane. We can never say that in times of war that the law is set aside. It is never set aside. And sometimes war is inevitable. And if it is inevitable, then the international humanitarian law exists to protect people and to limit weapons. And of course, I think also the tactics that are being used, and also to ensure that those people that are participating in the war are accountable. I hope you get this. And there's a saying that is used mostly by the humanitarian actors that when humanity humanity doesn't is it humanity never disappears on the battlefield, but it must guide the war. So in this case, we conclude by saying the international humanitarian law exists not to stop war, but to make it tolerable. Okay? So, and that brings us to the importance, custodian, and the sanctions, which in our discussion we have already mentioned. Because what is the importance of international law? It protects, it maintains peace and security, it creates order, it facilitates, it ensures accountability. And what are the examples? Of course, we have already mentioned about it. Maybe something that we didn't mention, who are the custodians? In this case, remember always that the person that holds the international humanitarian law as the bedrock of it is the International Committee of the Red Cross. If you refer to our history of the international law, then you will understand why I'm saying the International Committee of the Red Cross is actually the guardian of the IHL. Then, as I have just read for you from the Constitution of Kenya, states themselves ratify these treaties and then they enforce them. But the person that actually holds this also is the United Nations and, of course, the International Court of Justice. What are the sanctions? The sanctions are diplomatic, they are economic, they are military actions, and I think you have seen it happen here. When we have diplomatic sanctions where they say, so and so will not be able to travel because you have been participating in or you have breached the international law. The individual sanctions, the prosecution for war, when you're being taken to ICC, that is one of the sanctions of that law. Then reparations like compensation, restitution, compliance, and reputational costs. Of course, reputational cost when you are being known as now the country that is not actually implementing or is going against the international humanitarian law. There is also that reputational cost where when you get to somewhere and someone, of course, Kenyans, we are known for wearing our wrist, our what? It's called what? The band. Yeah. By the time people are seeing that, they are saying, oh, that's a Kenyan. Of course, it has now done what? It has cost us our reputation. Okay. So, mhm. um, so now let's do a reflection. And this reflection is international a fragile hope in a face of political and military power? When international law is actually built on hope, the nations could be guided by the rules of international law, but not power. And what is the aim? The aim of international law is to bring order, is to create an environment where justice can be accessed, it can be seen, and that there's accountability to the world, you know. Yet in reality, that hope is often tested. And most of the time, I can tell you, it's even broken. And broken by who? Broken by the political and the military power. Yeah? You will find that there are some powerful countries, time and again, you know, they will just act outside the law when it is convenient for them. Those of you who are old enough, you will remember that in 2003 there was the invasion of Iraq that was carried out without the UN approval. Yeah. And there was nothing that was done. Yeah. So bring it home. Even within institutions like International Criminal Court, yeah, where some of our political leaders have been taken to, you know, and justice appears to be selective. Selective in this way. Tell me who has been prosecuted before the ICC. Yeah. That we have said indeed the process has been good. It is because the international law is so fragile. It gets to a point where someone says, we are not signatories. We want to withdraw our signatory. Yeah. Yet we have put it in our constitution. So these examples and these things actually explain or rather expose a very painful truth that while international law is something that most states subscribe to and confess to be guided by, it often lacks the power to enforce its own rule. So therefore it will depend on the state's willingness to comply. And that willingness can vanish, you know, when their interests are at stake. Yeah. When they know that if we go this way, then our interests are not going to be met, then they will set it aside. Yet you will realize that despite these weaknesses, the international law still matters. Yeah. It provides us with a common language as on the universal arena, and it's, you know, like even if they are going to do whatever they want to do, they are restrained. They know that these excesses that are being meted on humanity is not right. Yeah. And so in the end, we find that international law may not be strong enough to stop every war or punish every person or say violation, but it is a fragile hope that keeps humanity's dream of justice alive. And for us who are practitioners, We hang on to it because it reminds us that power without principle is never sustainable. Now we move to the next and maybe our last segment is on humanitarian coordination. So humanitarian coordination, what does it really mean? It refers to that process of bringing together the humanitarian actors. And these actors are usually coordinated. So that coordination is coordinated by a humanitarian coordinator. Yeah. The UN has designated a leader for coordinating these responses. And this person is actually known as ERC, Emergency Relief Coordinator. Yeah. This person is also referred to, sometimes I think it is used interchangeably, is the Secretary General, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. So the ERC is usually the head of, remember we talked about OCHA, Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and usually is responsible for leading the coordination of humanitarian responses in crises. And now the crisis is not only about armed conflict, it has extended to natural disasters. Yeah. So, what is the purpose of coordination? Coordination ensures that there's a coherent and effective response to emergency. It is coordinated, it is not haphazard, it is not spontaneous, but it is coordinated. Okay? So, the aim is to avoid duplication and fill gaps and maximize impact for affected population. We've already talked about the objectives of humanitarian coordination, which we'll mention here in passing because we've already talked, I think, about it. It's just to promote accountability so that people are accountable for what they are doing. Even if it is humanitarian intervention or actions, there must always be accountability. Yeah, so that you remain and you're seen to be above board. Yeah. Then there's also the efficient use of resources, because we can find ourselves misusing the resources or underusing the resources, okay, when there's no such coordination. And also ensure that there's effective delivery of aid and strengthen the cooperation. So the main humanitarian coordination mechanism is that is led by the UN. Just as I have already talked about the Emergency Relief Coordinator, OCHA. Then there's also the other mechanism of ensuring that humanitarian intervention or actions are coordinated is through the cluster system. We are going to talk about the cluster system in a few. So that cluster system also assists in ensuring that humanitarian action is coordinated well, so that they ensure that the resources are either used well or the resources are not wasted. Then there's the humanitarian country teams. The humanitarian country teams include the NGOs, of course, the National Red Cross in each country or Red Crescent, the donors, yeah. Then there's the civil military coordination. I think you have seen that the military and the civilians have coordinated humanitarian actions in places where maybe sometimes the humanitarian intervention or humanitarian workers are not able to go there. Then we have the local and the national authorities, which come under now the NGOs and such. So this coordination mechanism, as I've already mentioned, is just to ensure that we avoid duplication, we ensure accountability, and maximize the use of resources. This table here just shows how humanitarian is coordinated. You see, like we have the OCHA, then we have the humanitarian coordinator. Humanitarian coordinator comes into clusters, and under the humanitarian coordinator, which is usually the country coordinator or the team leader in the country, then we have the NGO and, of course, the government. So let's talk about the cluster system. What is the cluster system? I will request that we type it in the chat. Please tell me what the cluster system. Yes, neutrality is indeed is really not an ongoing debate, but it is something that most of us who are in the humanitarian space discuss it a lot. And why do we discuss it? We discuss it a lot because you will find that it is something that is hard to live by. You know, it is hard. It is actually hard to even implement or even phantoms, so to speak, because I'm now taking a break a little as I look at as I look at the charts. And one of the interesting questions that I've seen here is neutrality is an ongoing debate. Yes, it is a debate. And why do we say it is a debate? It's a debate because it is something that we do not know how to live above it. Remember what I said, that we are getting the donor funding. We are getting government interventions. But at the same time, we are expected to remain neutral. How do you remain neutral when all this are pulling on the sides? Someone is using aid as a weapon. So it's an ongoing debate, but it remains a cardinal principle. I don't know what Eunice meant by saying avoid being biased. Do we have an exam? Cluster system to strengthen coordination. Okay. So let's continue. I have requested that I want you to tell me what cluster system is in the chat. After I've done this, we will look at it, but let's make progress. The cluster system was actually introduced in 2005, just as what the slide says, by the UN as part of the humanitarian reform process. It is actually designed to strengthen the coordination and ensure that the interventions are predictable during large-scale emergencies. Why do we have them? Why do we have these cluster systems? Yeah, we have this cluster system because we need to organize humanitarian actors by sectors. We will see how the main clusters are, and then we will understand by what we mean that humanitarian actors should be classified by sectors. And this classification of sectors ensures that there is no duplication and that there is no gaps in aid delivery. And then we also make sure that because we have cluster system, it is clarified who is leading what and who is leading when, and this also actually ensures that there's accountability. Then it also facilitates, of course, partnership, collaboration amongst all the UN agencies. So how do they work? They work, each cluster organization works in the same area of response. For example, where there is health, then you will find the WHO, you will find the NGOs that are concerned with in the health sector or the food or such. So each cluster is led by a designated UN agency. Sometimes it is co-led with an NGO. Not necessarily that you have to have a UN agency, but maybe an NGO has coordinated, of course, with the UN agency or with the Red Cross in the country, and so they are leading that aid. So that cluster coordinates at both the global level and also at the country level. So the cluster system is very beneficial because it ensures that there's efficiency, which we have already talked about, there's collaboration or partnership, and also there's accountability, and there's also the it is predictable. But cluster system comes with a limitation. Because if you are in the health sector, you have to be guided by the bureaucracy in that main cluster. And this bureaucracy can actually slow down, the delivery of the intervention. Okay, it can also risk excluding local actors because you are already coming in with your experts. So what is the position of the local community? Even if we already have, say, nurses on the ground, or we already have doctors, but you have already come with your own doctors because you belong to a certain sector and you're coming on the ground, you're actually excluding the local actors. Yeah. And sometimes it creates silos instead of integrated approach. Because you see, like now, when you are in the health sector, you're in the shelter, you're in the protection, you're in the education, you're not able to go across that cluster of viewers for you to be able to give another intervention because of that silo thing. You cannot, you are in the health sector, you cannot be able to give nutrition. You cannot be able to give education, even if you have teachers amongst yourself. You cannot also be able to, give food because you're not in the food security. So you see, it's creating that silo instead of integrating it. Unless now this NGO or this agency is a is in several, like now the Red Cross, maybe it has the health sector like that or the shelter, but most NGOs are limited when it comes to offering these interventions because they concentrate on one thing. They either concentrate on education, they either concentrate on health, or they either concentrate on food. So it is not they are not able to offer the humanitarian intervention, across. Um, yeah, so we come to the main global cluster and their leaders, or rather their leads. Health, we have the World Health Organization that leads that cluster. But now under this, we also have, as I've already mentioned, please remember, we have the World Health Organization, but still we have NGOs that also work with the World Health Organization. We have the food security, its lead agency is, of course, the World Food Program and the FAO. We have nutrition, we have water, shelter, protection, logistics, and emergency communication. So you see, every cluster has its lead. Yeah. So these clusters, they avoid overlap. They ensure that there's efficiency, and more so, they also ensure that there is accountability. Okay? So, how do these clusters work? These clusters work in groups. They are led by a UN agency, what I have already mentioned, and as I've already talked about, their challenges. And so we move to the next one, and I think this will be the last one. I think we have gone beyond the time, but in the next 10 minutes, we will be done. So, coordination tools. I always want people to understand what we are talking about. So, what are the coordination tools? These are the practical mechanism that is used in humanitarian action to make sure different actors are working together. Okay? These coordination tools are categorized to ensure that the interventions, or rather the people that are working together, are coordinated. So the first category, in any case, when you start doing something, first of all, you have to do the planning, then we have the coordination. So under planning, under the category of planning, you have to do an overview. So it is the humanitarian needs overview. Just before you leave your office and you're saying, now we are going to do we are going to carry out an intervention somewhere. The first tool that is done is the human needs overview. Then there is also the part of monitoring, because you cannot start the humanitarian interventions when you cannot monitor them. So you must have the monitoring frameworks. So these tools ensure that there is joint needs assessment, there's planning, and then there's tracking of the response. There's also the coordination structures, which we have already talked about, the humanitarian country team, the cluster system, and the civil and military coordination. But most important is the information management, because as we always say in the legal sector, everyone, God for us all, but everyone, you must bring your own data. So this data is in the information management. We have the 3W, we have the 4W, and we even have the 5W mapping. And also we have the situation reports. These are the data collection, we analyze and we share. We will be taking a look at what the 3 and 4W and 5W is. Of course, we have the financial tools, and we also have the communication and accountability tools. But I think what is more important in this session is how to manage the information. Because by the time you're getting on the ground where the humanitarian intervention is required, all this has been done, but then you need, as you are on the ground, to ensure that you have analyzed the data and you have shared it, with other participants. So this is an example of a 3W. 3W talks about who, what, and where. So it's the actor, the activity, and the location. The 4W talks about who is the actor, what is the activity, where is the location, and when is the period. And the 5W talks about who is the actor, what is the activity, where is the location, when is the period, and for whom are we doing this? And that means what is the target group? Let's take an example of Red Cross. Red Cross is the actor. What is the activity? Emergency shelter. Where is the location? It is in Homa Bay. When is the period? It is between July and September. And why? Because there were floods. And for whom? For 300 households. So when you look at this, yeah, you will find that there are 3,000 households that have been displaced. And most likely, these 3,000 households will therefore need what? Medical interventions. And as Macmillan University College, we are an NGO that is participating in this. And so we know that for 3,000 households, how many nurses will we need to assist? We need this number of nurses. So this is the reason why we have the coordination tools, because it helps us to do what? To ensure that um, we have provided updates on needs, we have filled the gaps, and we show the progress. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this series. But what do we take away? We take away the core humanitarian principles that guide all the humanitarian actions. We take away the basics of international humanitarian law that protects people and objects in conflicts. We have learned about effective coordination, and we have also looked at the 3W, the 4W, and the support better response. We come to an end of our series, not because we have run out of ideas, but because it's time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mildred. Mildred is an advocate of the High Court. So thank you so much. We have been able to understand the legal aspect of the humanitarian series, and you broken it down so well. So we have now an understanding of what should be done, and also an expectation to it and guiding principles. So thank you so much for taking us through. I know time is far much gone, but knowledge is power. We are happy that we spent a few more minutes past the designated time, but for our own good. So thank you so much, Mildred. We are so grateful. Um, I think we now come to a close. I will give it a minute for anyone who has any Q&A, any recommendation, any question, any comment. This would be the time to just unmute and ask, or pass it through the chat box. Also, what is very important that we register our attendance through the chat box. So if you can have us just registering our attendance in the chat box, that would be so nice. But we are grateful. Is there anyone who has a comment or a question? Daisy, you can say hi to us, and then we can call it a good day because we have learned quite a lot today. Thank you. Okay. I see there isn't much reaction, and I don't hear anyone saying anything through the chat box. So I'd want to thank all of us for attending today's meeting. We're going to communicate on email on a final seminar that will be coming through in a week's time or in 2 weeks. We're going to have that one as physical. So we're going to guide on how we conduct the next meetings and the next webinar. But I'm so happy that we are here. We've got the information we needed. And I'd like to end it for today. I know there are people who are moving and are hoping to do various activities. So thank you so much. And I hope to meet all of you physically when we'll be having the physical seminar. Mildred, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I'd want to wish us a good evening for Irini. And I see someone say great presentation with clarity. Thank you. That's from Eunice Mutemi. Simon Deritu says thank you for the information delivered out so well. Thank you. Um, thank you. Someone has given some comment on the slides. That is well noted. So let's register. I will not drop the call, but I'd give us time to register our attendance. Despite Oloni says this presentation was awesome. Thank you for that feedback. This um this this series has been brought up or sponsored by Macmillan Medical Training College. So also for the Macmillan team joining us today, we are grateful. My name is Sarah Uganda and I stand in as chief principal of Macmillan Medical Training College. So we are grateful for the great sponsor as well. So I wish us a good evening. We'll communicate on our emails. That's why we need us to register through the chat box. So we'll communicate on the next series and how we meet up for the physical seminar. Thank you so much and have a good night.
Thank you and good night to all.
Okay, bye.